Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Albert Garcia. I'm Senior Interactive Producer here at Law at the Margins, and we are so happy to have you all here and if you're either watching us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Periscope, or here in our Crowdcast platform. I'm so happy to have you here for our webinar around collaborative journalism and a little more of a discussion of our community-based newsroom that Law at the Margins has launched as a real model for kind of grassroots community media involvement, and really getting to the heart of stories that will have not just an impact on people's lives, but also lead to the change that we need in this world today. We're going to have a host of different speakers here who've been involved with our community newsroom, and really talking to both some of the reporters and people that we assigned to cover in our latest project of the We the Immigrant multimedia series. That was the real kind of first launch of our community newsroom. And we'll also be, talking with some community organizers as well as some of the folks, at the publications that we collaborated with to really get a good sense of not just some of the lessons learned, but also a particular model for the future. Law at the Margins, uses social media as a dynamic platform from which to highlight the ways laws and legal institutions expands or limits the rights and the social justice aspirations of people and communities. We've been around, doing these webinars for the last 4 to 5 years, really under the leadership, of our founder and editor, Chaumtoli Huq, who's also a professor of law at CUNY Law School. We're having some technical issues this morning, so she's on, and we'll get her up, in the screen. But I also wanted to use this opportunity to also bring forth and introduce Eric Ortiz, who's the executive editor with our community newsroom project. We've recently launched a GoFundMe campaign to help support the newsroom project and such series like our We the Immigrant series. So I want to switch it over now to Eric. Tell us a little bit about the project, as well as some of the things that and really kind of key us off this afternoon.
Thanks, Albert, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really excited to have you all participating today. I want to start off with a story. It's about an engineer and architect from the early 20th century who went to Harvard, and he was kicked out of Harvard twice. Very smart person, but he did not believe in the practices and systems that they had there. In terms of designing buildings, he had a different vision for engineering. And so he went on his own path. He didn't want to fight with the engineers, and he wanted to do his own thing and create his own, he believed in his own way of doing engineering and architecting. And so he, in his early years, was unsuccessful. He actually lived with his family in government housing, but he persevered, persisted, and he eventually became one of the successful engineers, inventors, futurists, and considered now one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. His name was Buckminster Fuller, and he had a quote that I believe is applicable to what we're doing with community-based newsroom. He said that you never change something by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing reality, the existing model, obsolete. And what we want to do here with community-based newsroom is create a new model for media. As we all know, media right now is in a difficult position. It no longer is a trusted institution, and there's a lot of stories that aren't being told. And we want to change that with focus on underrepresented communities and voices that aren't being heard to help those stories get told. And that's why we launched Community-Based Newsroom in April of this year. And we've been able to publish some really important stories and some great stories. Overall, we published 17 stories. They've been from authors who are professional journalists and also writers who have been impacted by law and policy who are not professional journalists. And our model is a little different than the traditional newsroom model. We believe that there are people who aren't professional journalists, but who have, something important to say and something important to contribute to journalism. And so we've been working with, we started by working with non-professional journalists and helping amplify their stories, tell their stories. So we've had authors who have been incarcerated, one who was on death row before he was executed in July. He wrote a piece for us about how he found redemption. We've had his 13-year-old daughter then wrote a piece about how she did not want her father to die. We had a piece from an immigrant rights activist who has now been targeted by ICE, just to name a few. And these are the types of stories that we're looking to do. We just published a series in November called We the Immigrants, which was our first big project, and original that included original on-the-ground reporting. We commissioned, thanks to a grant from Solutions Journalism Network, we were able to commission 5 writers, professional journalists from all across the country to write 5 stories in different communities and regions around the U.S., examining, exploring, how different immigrant communities are organizing and mobilizing to address immigration issues. We're very happy with the way the series turned out. We were able to produce 5, really great stories that focused on issues and communities that aren't getting a lot of attention in the media. Immigration, as we know, is a huge, very important issue right now. You see it every day on the news, but a lot of the headlines that appear and the stories that are told, they just kind of are the sensational ones that don't really get to the heart of the matter. It's always talking about the problem, but it's never presenting solutions. And so part of what this project was not just saying what the problem is, but looking at solutions and really how examining and reporting and documenting how communities themselves are mobilizing and organizing to find solutions and to address these issues that are impacting their lives. And a lot of times it's unjust, and there's a lot of injustices in the world, and this is just one example of that. That we were able to really delve into the topic of immigration and do it in a very successful way. This is the kind of work that we want to do more of. That's why, right now, our organization it's been purely a volunteer project. This grant that we were able to receive was really the first, money we were able to pay for our writers and journalists. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough for us to produce, some strong on-the-ground reporting. And this is what we want to do, is produce more, top quality journalism. And that's why we're doing this. We believe that there's a lot of stories that need to be told, and we want to help tell them from those on the margins, the people who have been in communities that are underrepresented, whose voices have been ignored by traditional media. These are low-income people. They are, people who, don't fit into, what always, media wants to show. And most often, these people are the subjects of stories. They are not the primary storyteller or reporter or voice that's telling the story. But, we believe that by giving them the opportunity to tell their story and then helping them along the way to tell their story, by serving as a guide, an editorial guide, we edit their stories, we work with them so that they are great journalism, and they're polished, they're professional, and then we publish them. And so it takes time to do this work, and that effort is we want to compensate people for this time and effort. And so that's why we launched the crowdfunding campaign. We're looking to raise some money so that we can expand our operations. The other thing about CBNR, community-based newsroom, is that, we're big believers in collaboration and collaborative journalism. And it's a term that's becoming more popular. It's about working with others, collaborating to create journalism. And that's what we want to do with CBNR. really open to collaboration. With this project, We the Immigrants, it was an example of collaborative journalism in the production aspect. We had our reporters collaborating with people in the community. We had, after the stories were published, we collaborated with other media organizations to distribute the stories and to get them published in other outlets to help raise awareness of this work. And some of those people will be speaking today. Dick Price at LA Progressive, David Brandon, Queens Daily Eagle, but this is, we believe that by work, newsrooms have limited resources these days. They're shrinking, they're getting smaller. You cannot cover every story. That's why, we want to collaborate with the community. We believe that if you can, turn the community into a newsroom, you can expand the size of your newsroom. And that's what we're doing, one story at a time. It's a very, incremental process. We understand the challenge we face and the obstacles that are in front of us, but, we believe in this mission. Very passionate about bringing stories to light that need to be told, giving an opportunity to people, voices to be heard, in their own words, and really then working with them to help, make those words as professional and effective as possible, so that, we can communicate the message in the most effective way. And then, the last step is not just about, communicating the message and documenting what's happening, but, we want to spur change and action and lead to change and action so that, come up, document the problems, come up with solutions, document the solutions, and then, spur people to action to really lead to change. There's a lot of problems right now that need fixing, but really want to focus on, our focus is on social justice and, all the injustices that are happening, and really from the people that are impacted by law and policy. And so we have started, looking at, the criminal justice system, immigration, but there's a lot of issues of social justice that warrant attention. And that's what we want to do. By expanding our operations, we want to, our next goal is to publish one story a week, from people in communities, underrepresented communities who have stories to tell, and we want to help them tell those stories. And so this model of grassroots community media is really, flipping the traditional model of journalism, which has been a top-down model. We really want to make it a bottom-up and really from the ground up, really work with people, on the margins, the people who have been dehumanized and marginalized, and really help humanize them and help empower them to tell their stories so that they can become, the reporters for their community, the storytellers for their community, the documenters in their community. And there are a few organizations that are doing it, but we believe that more can do this model, and we want to create a model that can be replicated anywhere. We've been very pleased with the work we've been able to do. We've gotten great, response from others, and we're bringing on new collaborators to join us. That's why this webinar is another step in that to help raise awareness of the work we're doing, to help bring more people on board. Hopefully, we can raise this money, because it takes money to produce journalism. It's been given away for free. People read it for free on the internet, but it costs money to produce great journalism. And so people need to understand that. And I think people do value it. And it's just a matter of asking them and making it easy for them to contribute. You look at all the things that people will pay for nowadays. A cup of coffee costs $5 or more in some places. That what we're asking to create a piece of journalism is a cup of coffee. And so it's not a lot when you put it in perspective, but it's really important because journalism has the power to change society. To make society better for the greater good. And that's what we need right now. You look at just the sad things that are happening around the world and really close to home now in the United States. You see things at the border that are just really heartbreaking to see. And so these are the stories we want to bring to light in a human way that's not just sensationalizing the issue, but really putting it in terms that people can relate to. And then the goal is, to tell that story, find solution, and then spur people to change, to work to change, to take action. And so that's, what we're doing. We have some other people who are going to talk about it. So I'm really excited to be doing this, be participating in this. And I thank you all for joining us and helping us, advance this cause. Next speakers up are going to be Michael Nigro, who was a reporter on our We the Immigrants series, great professional multimedia journalist that we, happy to work with him. Also, Carla Pineda was another writer for the Immigrants series. She is based in Los Angeles. Michael's based in New York, and she's a digital producer for KCETLink. And thank you both for joining us, and take it away.
Yeah, let's Michael. I think if as Eric said, part of what we really want to do is really get to the heart of these stories here. And Michael, I know you had concentrated on your stories concentrated how the Yemeni activists were changing kind of a whole community's mindset, right? Led by Yemeni bodega owners in New York City. Carla, I know that you also you were specifically looking how grassroots activists and technologies are being used in Miami, right? And so these are also, we're also going to be joined pretty soon by independent journalist Shannon Luders-Manuel, who explored how South Asian immigrants were helping in the Pacific Northwest. We're working together to help individuals and families. So Michael, can you kind of kick us off and talk a little bit about about your story and how you went about and some of the themes that kind of came up as this entire kind of series was looking into the different ways in which immigrant communities were reacting to this?
Right. So my name is Michael Nigro. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm a multimedia journalist. I write, I live stream. I'm a photojournalist as well, and I've covered everything from Standing Rock to Black Lives Matter to Charlottesville for a whole number of outlets. And when Eric and Chaumtoli first told me about the community-based newsroom, it was an exciting opportunity for me because having worked in large outlets and covered stories for larger and smaller outlets, it's often really difficult to get an editor to say yes to a story that doesn't have legs, doesn't have steam to it. And a perfect example of that is Kurt Guyette in the Flint water crisis. He had been covering that for 18 months, I think, before any mainstream media took hold. And it's still an issue today. But for me, and what they had asked us to do is what was the immigrant crisis and Trump's travel ban. So we got to talking about that. And as it turned out, I had covered for another outlet the Yemeni bodega strike, which was February 2nd, 2017. And I was there just as a photojournalist, and I believe I live streamed that as well. But I didn't know any of the players there, but it was such a huge deal for the Yemeni community, which had basically been living in the shadows. And those aren't my words, those are their words, that this community has been living in the shadows for years. And what I had told them is that when I was there, I had met and talked with a number of people and said that there are, actually Chaumtoli had said that there are other activists that have really come to the forefront and that we should probably look at them and see what they are doing and taking the mandate of what solutions journalism is, which is, you're looking at the community's response to a social justice issue. And their social justice issue is getting people to leave war-torn Yemen and to get here. And with Trump's travel ban, it became a huge problem. You have, even when I first started the story, many people weren't even covering yet. And now there seems to be quite a groundswell and that people are more and more talking about it. Bernie Sanders yesterday put out a bill, and it looks like the Senate said, overwhelmingly that they want to, say no to Saudi Arabia and their bombing campaign, which is being funded by America. I won't trail off into that right now, but as it turned out, I was put in contact with a number of activists who I actually had photographs of at the bodega strike. And that was a bonus and a benefit for me because I am a guy who is completely on the outside of the Yemeni community. I'm a white New Yorker, and I'm asking to really enter their lives and ask them what they're doing to combat this and how they can, how they're helping their community to fix this. But having covered this and a whole number of other protests that they started with after the bodega strike happened, really kind of put me in a nice position to gain their trust and be able to interview them and embed myself with them at certain points to find out what they're actually doing. And it was a different way of working for me. Solutions journalism is not a fluff piece. It's not an advocacy piece. And it was not like a live piece where I'm just sitting there and I needed to delve in and find out what this community was about and then find the story that could tell the story of a community, which is daunting. And I think that, looking at this type of journalism it's to go back to the Flint water crisis. It is hard to get editors to say yes to something. And especially if it's not, it doesn't trigger a money maker. It's not clickable. But this type of journalism has the power to have a ripple effect outward. And that's what I really looked for when I started to talk to some of the activists within the Yemeni community. And there are so many stories within it that you can make mini documentaries, you can make mini pieces on so many of these small stories. But what is it that kind of gives a blanket and a launch pad into letting people know what they're doing? And it's a really young group, and they're still getting their footing, but it has grown leaps and bounds. You're talking about, in my piece, I talked to one of the bodega owners who was also one of the organizers. And he just said, and every single person I talked to, that this bodega strike on February 2nd, 2017 was one of the proudest moments of their community's lives. And every single person said that. And the question is, why? Why was it so important? And I think what encapsulated most was when Zayag Nagy, who was one of the organizers, had said that after the strike, when everyone met, a gentleman came up to him and said, "I never thought I would ever see a Yemeni holding a microphone." And that, to me, was so elucidative to where they were, that they had been ignored and wanting to be ignored, they just wanted to live in the shadows. And that was his high bar, that somebody would be speaking out loud and openly and advocating for their community. And from there, I think it inspired a lot of other Yemeni activists to come together and create a community, and to create the Yemeni American Merchants Association, which is now actually in a year, they have brick and mortar. They have a storefront in the middle of Brooklyn. And from that brick and mortar storefront has rippled outward across the country. You have Yemeni activists that have joined in from all over the world, frankly. And what has happened is really saturated their type of, it's really saturated where they are. They're at maximum capacity, and they have told me, they just said, we are doing 10 different organizations' jobs at once. That's kind of the overview of how I came into it. And Albert, if you want to kind of take, or I can ask the question.
I think what's really interesting, Michael, is that, there's not, again, all these stories are communities. The immigrant community in the United States is really, a mosaic of a bunch of different folks. And depending on what part of the country you live in, some communities are there and obvious, but looking at it on a national scene, some people might not know, might not even think, when they think immigrant, they may not think about, about the Yemenis, the Yemenis community. I mean, in some ways, it's like that in Miami, right? Where I think nationally, a lot of times when we think about immigrants, there is this narrative about Latinos, and especially in a place like Florida, you think of Latinos, but Carla, you specifically were reporting on the Black immigrants in the South, specifically in South Florida, and their usage in terms of technology. Tell us a little bit about that, about that experience, about that story, and why it was so important in some ways, not just to concentrate on this community, but also the particular angle that you took in terms of the story that you focused on.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Carla. I'm a digital producer at KCET. It's part of the network, the PBS network here in LA. And just the nature of me being in LA made it a bit difficult to kind of tap resources across the country, 3,000 miles away, or in Texas, or in Boston. It was challenging but rewarding to kind of follow up and just kind of Chaumtoli was great at, I'm very grateful, she was great at putting me in touch with the right key people, and then they would just kind of lead me on to other people. So it was very important to kind of tell those stories, as Eric mentioned, as Michael mentioned, and as you said, Albert, that the narrative for immigration is typically told from a Latino standpoint. I'm a Latina, I'm Central American, my parents are Central American, so that's all I've really ever heard. But I had the chance to go down to Tijuana in February, March, I believe. I was down there for a project for KCET. It's called Earth Focus. It's a series called Earth Focus that touches on environmental issues. Last season focused on adaptation to environmental issues. And one of our episodes focused on climate migration and just the reasons, just kind of the thread of why people migrate. Oftentimes you don't think about it, but it goes back to, either natural disasters or just a changing environment. So the reason why I went down to Tijuana was because of the Haitian crisis down there, where a lot of Haitian people traveled up, not only from Haiti, but from Brazil, from I want to say like Ecuador, different countries throughout South America. They traveled up to the US-Mexico border when they learned that Obama was granting asylum because of the multiple hurricanes, the earthquake that happened down in Haiti. So when a lot of people started hearing that they were being granted asylum, it was interesting that a lot of the people I spoke to down there in Tijuana, they learned about it through technology. They learned about it through WhatsApp because they were staying in touch with friends. Facebook, all these mediums, even just like text messaging, whatever it was, they were staying in touch, and they were really connected to a lot of their friends and family from back home, from back in Haiti, even if they hadn't seen them in years at this point. So I thought that was really interesting, just that whole network that is created, that technology has allowed for. And so that's something we talked about with Eric and Chaumtoli when, I inquired about the project and I was hoping that I could participate. And we talked about what could happen, or, how that technology network played out here, once they crossed the U.S. For those who were able to cross to the U.S., whether it was before, when they were still being granted asylum, or even after. A lot of people who have crossed over after have been in detention for, some of them for years. Some of the subjects that I had a chance to speak with, one of them was in detention for almost 3 years. He was just bounced around, not really, his case wasn't really heard, even though he was actually coming from Africa. So even though he was persecuted for being queer in Africa, he had death threats on him, and he was almost deported back to his country, but there was just no system here. He just felt alone. He felt, he couldn't even communicate with family back home because of what was going on back home. So I just had a chance to hear all these stories and these heartbreaking stories. Gorleen, we cried on the phone together, when I was finally able to get her on the phone. We just sat there and we cried, and it's incredible, all the terrible, terrible, terrible things that people are going through, and they're not really being heard. Again, I'm going back to the immigration narrative being focused on Latinos. Before my trip to Tijuana to talk to people from Haiti, I hadn't really heard too much about Black immigrants and what they go through and how unique their struggle is, But to Michael's point about just solutions-based journalism, it was great to, when I was down there, a lot of them were just kind of burned by everything that they had been through in speaking with journalists, or all the media coverage they had received up to that point. And they would tell me, I don't want to be a sob story. I don't want it to be, if you're going to put me on TV, I don't want you to say how sad it is, that what I'm going through. I'm thriving here in Mexico, even though it's not the U.S. where I was intending to go. I'm thriving here. Show that, So I love that we had a chance with We the Immigrants, this project, we had a chance to talk about solutions. We had a chance to talk about how people, even though we're hearing these sad stories and we're sharing them, we also had to focus on how people are thriving once they get here, how people are overcoming challenges, how people are just kind of hustling and finding their way and finding their network, finding their communities, and really helping each other along the way. So that's my long-winded answer to why these stories were important, and why why this project was so important as well, the way we were able to tell stories.
Thank you, Carla. And everyone recognizes the importance of storytelling, and why, and not just in terms of the impact in terms of the narrative, but also how changing that narrative then has an impact both on policy and on people's lives. I want to also bring in independent journalist Shannon Luders-Manuel. I know he's having some issues with the video, so I'm hoping we can still hear you. Shannon, can you hear us? Hello? Okay, we might have to get you on the phone line. Hello? Okay. Well, as we try to queue up Shannon back there. Okay. Shannon, can you tell us a little bit about, in terms of the work that you did? I know you were concentrating specifically in the Pacific Northwest. Tell us a little bit about, the community there and how they're working together, just in terms of how families are adjusting to after being released from detention. Shannon?
Okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. So I'm Shannon Luders-Manuel, and I'm based in LA, covering the South Asian detainees in Sheridan, Oregon. And a struggle for me was I wasn't able to connect with any of the detainees or their families. Me and totally believe that this is probably because they're still in something that's so that's ongoing, and so they're afraid to speak to the press because they've just in Sheridan they were facing such awful conditions and at the border, and so and they're still in the process of getting asylum, and so they don't want to say anything that might jeopardize that. Really, just because they couldn't get their own voices. Such an important part. So, but I was able to talk and different parts of the community came to help get the detainees out and to give them support once they got out. And it was through mainly the post-detention network, post-detention respite network, and the Immigrants. I talked to someone from each of those organizations, and what's interesting is that people faces different coming together to help these detainees, and didn't want it to be. It was really inspiring to see that. So a large number of the detainees were Sikh, and there's a Sikh community in that area of Oregon. So they were really able to those detainees and volunteers who aren't Sikh to understand like what they need, etc. So center is actually it's a prison, and so for whatever reason these detainees were sent to prison. It was because they were so but they just experienced horrible there and were stuck there for months without being given any contact with the outside world. So the organizations, they worked with lawyers, with largely worked with lawyers to speak to the courts to start getting these detainees out. And each detainee came out. There was, but people could wait in shift at the detention center. Time someone was released, they were there to take them to get them clothes, find a place for them to stay. And something that really stuck with me that one of the volunteers never shared with me is that even they needed so much because they had nothing shit. So even that, but then to sustain them through the night, and so she get so that they can have proper meals. So anyway, it was for me. It was a bit of a challenge just because I really knew nothing about. I knew nothing about the Sikh community or the Sikh culture, religion, and I had never reported on the South Asian community before, and I really didn't want this. Just because I'm a minority, just because I have, it doesn't mean that experiences the same as theirs. So I didn't want to or lump everyone together. It's really important for me to really talk to people and story justice. Yeah. Another thing, because I want to talk about improved with these community outreach things, and that was because, you know, it's easy to talk about, and obviously very important to talk about, and but everyone was so supportive of each other. The different organizations were so supportive of each other, which is great. But then it was a little difficult to get, okay, how can for the next for community support. So I got a little bit of feedback there about just Ron, he's the Christian faith movement. He was saying that, no, obviously a big problem is in the community, understand what's going on with the South Asian immigrants, with the Sikhs specifically, and that obviously tolerance. So, but organization, but I wanted to make sure that I presented it in a real way.
And we see a lot of that. I think we've heard from all the different reporters, whether it was Shannon or Carla or Michael, this real dedication to getting the story right, and getting the narrative right. And I think one of the things about solutions-based journalism is that I think we see a sensitivity, from reporters and folks involved, because they understand what the power of words is when it comes to kind of creating something. I want to bring in our founder, theMargins founder and editor, Chaumtoli Huq, just to kind of bring us in as we continue to move forward. To talk a little bit more about the purpose of not just these projects, these stories, but also what we have, not only what we actually got out of the We the Immigrants project, what we were hoping to get, but then also what was really kind of produced. Chaumtoli, if you can kind of lead us into the next next stage.
Great. Yes. Hi, Albert. Thank you so much for leading us and moderating this conversation. I want to also thank Eric Ortiz, who has been sort of my partner in, I don't want to say crime, because I think we're doing good work, and really putting his heart and soul. Like you said, we started this out as voluntary. Hope it will not remain voluntary, that we would pay. And so just a big shout out to Eric Ortiz for conceiving this as Grassroots community media. And then again, just to give special thanks to Michael, Carla, and Shannon, as well as Paul Street and Irvis Orozco, who are the other reporters on this particular series. It speaks to the larger mission of Law at the Margins. The community-based newsroom is one sort of project of Law at the Margins, but the broader goal is a commitment to centering those who are most marginalized. I come to this conversation as 20 years of community-based lawyering and activism. And from the legal side, and this is something I'm learning also as I'm learning from the journalist side, is trust of our profession, knowledge of communities that we serve, being in the community and rooted and listening is so key towards representation and access. And I've been hearing Michael, Carla, and Shannon speak to trust, accountability, doing the job right, telling the story right. Those are exactly the same questions that we think about as advocates. And I hope in the second part, along with our community media partners at LA Progressive, as well as Queens Daily Eagle, that we can start to think about getting to that challenges. And soon I'm going to invite Maura, who's an immigrant rights activist on the West Coast, also a contributor as an activist. So from her vantage point, as someone who works extensively with journalists, hearing the kind of the real talk of where we do things right, where we can get better. So we're going to hear from her shortly. But a couple of things I just wanted to mention back about Law at the Margins is centering the voices that aren't heard. So one piece of this work is curating the journalists to work with and learn to work with what we call community collaborators, and learning to know these communities. I think that's part of our professional obligation. But the other piece, the piece that I don't want to get lost in here, is that who gets to tell the story? Who gets to write the story? And I firmly believe that it should not be mediated by either me as the lawyer or even any of us as the journalists. So a big part of Eric and my work is cultivating new writers and, if you will, citizen journalists, but giving the guidance so that they can write their stories in a way that would be accessible to the mainstream media and not seen as, oh, that's just their personal or op-ed piece, that it's actually considered as serious, rigorous journalism. So there's two prongs to this, is cultivating new writers. And we, as Eric mentioned at the beginning, we have writers such as Chandra Delaney, who is a prison abolitionist, a mother of 2 incarcerated sons, who now is an activist in commenting on the criminal justice system, and other writers as well. And so I think that's the second piece. And so with that, I want to bring in Maura to just share a little bit about her work. You can find her piece around how ICE has targeted her and continues to target her, and her work, and some suggestions on how communities can work, journalists can work better. And here I want to just mention, as a lawyer, I work very closely with Shannon, and being in the South Asian community. Here, I think as lawyers, we have to take accountability. I think part of the challenges of the Oregon case is that the narrative was controlled in large part by lawyers. And I think I'm going to just say it. I think I might lose some friends here. And I think that when we control the narrative, we make immigrants afraid of telling their story. If you tell it, all these things are going to happen. And I would like us to really challenge ourselves to give up control of the narrative, and to really renew democracy, to really sort of figure out how can we use our profession and privilege to allow the story to come out. So with that, I'm excited to have Maura join us. She's a dear friend and a really phenomenal activist and a writer in her own right.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Maura Villalpando. I'm based in Bellingham, Washington, about a little bit more than 100 miles north of Tacoma, Washington, where we have one of the biggest detention centers in the West Coast for immigrants. It's called the Northwest Detention Center. I'm an undocumented immigrant. I moved here to the Seattle area in '96. I came with a visa, and I end up overstaying my visa, like many millions of people have done, especially in that '96 year where laws were changed under the Clinton administration. So I'm one of the byproducts of the '96 changes in immigration law. And Chaumtoli, I'm glad you said it. I always say it. I'm glad to hear others that lawyers control the narrative. Most of my work has been working directly with lawyers. One of the reasons why I started working on this was not only because I'm undocumented, but because lawyers kept scaring me, telling me, actually, most people didn't know I was undocumented until 2014 when I came up publicly as undocumented. But lawyers would always tell us, if you're undocumented, don't say anything. Don't go to the detention center when it opened back in 2004. Don't. And so that really created a big hurdle for my work, which is organizing my own undocumented community. what Shannon was talking about, what Carol was talking about, what Michael was talking about is precisely my work, right? Is to work with other communities, not my Latinx community only, but other communities that are undocumented. So here, for example, we have a hard time getting a lot of Asian communities that are undocumented to come out to events, to join a workshop. And so part of my toolbox is working directly with media, precisely because we don't have political capital. We don't have jobs that pay to do this. We're also volunteers. We don't have a staff. One of the biggest tools, obviously, is media and earned media, of course. So my job has been to create and foster media relations, but develop our own media in some instances if it's necessary. So we're always looking for those opportunities to collaborate with others that will help us get our story out. It's really hard to work with media, like it's really hard to work with lawyers. And if people, I assume, don't know me, but wherever I go and speak, I complain about lawyers. But we have found a couple of really good lawyers here and there, community lawyers that we hold dearly. And same with media. We have found very few reporters that we trust, that we can give them a heads up on something. So I'm going to give you an example, just the most recent case that we had, a hunger striker that just passed away last week. When we learned about this, we called only one reporter. And it was a really hard decision. How do we make this public? We don't know the whole story. But we figured that making it public will pressure ICE to tell what was happening to these men. And it worked. We had to risk it. And that's part of our job, is to take risks. Not only being undocumented and being public, but to the fact that we had to release his name. We had to say, based on the witness account that we had, somebody died in the detention center. It turns out that he was taken unconscious from the detention center to the hospital. He never regained conscious. The day he was taken away from the detention center was November 15. He was declared brain dead on November 18, but that was not public until November 24. That's when ICE, actually, no, the hospital told us that he had passed, and ICE waited till Monday. That was a Saturday. They waited until Monday to release a press release. Obviously, that created some tension in media against us, saying you were wrong. He didn't die on November 15. And we say, like, this is the way we handle it. We'll love to go public and say we are wrong. I don't mind saying we were wrong. He's alive, but where is he? What are the conditions that he's at? And that's when that's the exactly kind of support we needed from journalists, from people that could access what we can't. So again, it's working this back and forth relationship where we will give you what we have, but we know that you're going to use it in a way that will continue supporting our work. For us, it was important not only to find out where is he, how is he, what's going to happen to him. We are worried about his safety, but also not to forget that there's 1,575 people still in the detention center in Tacoma. There's 44,000 detained right now across the nation. So always pushing on that. We got a very few media reports on this story that highlighted that. The vast majority just took ICE press releases and published it, and that makes our work more difficult because now we have to keep countering what ICE says, and we don't want to enter into that. The last thing we want is to be being, he said, we said, right? But I think for not only having a space for us to write, it's important that our stories are told exactly like we want them to be told, but we want to ensure that other journalists that want to do this kind of work with us understand that there's a long-term goal, that there's sometimes we have to make decisions that are really, really hard, but we have to make them. We have to do something immediately. Sometimes we can't wait. We had an expose on medical neglect at the Northwest Detention Center releasing early October. And we knew that we worked with the reporter on this, the journalist on this, and they were waiting for some FOIAs to come through, and we said, that's going to take years. Sometimes you probably won't get those. The outlet understood. They released this immediately, and there was a follow-up on that as well. The great thing was that it was a great expose. We used it. There was a downside to this. One of the featured stories was deported almost immediately after the release of that expose. But the journalists worked with us on a second piece to say, is this retaliation? Which totally was. And we're still working on getting that person back. Sajat Ankara, that was sent to Sierra Leone. And again, I think that it's a dance that we dance with our journalists, with reporters, with lawyers. There's so many other professional law areas of work that we deal with. We know this is an intersectional in many issues areas, but for us, what is important is to understand what is the goal, what is our goal, and how we want the things to be handled, so we can actually accomplish, in our case, to what people in detention wants us to do. They are leaders. We've always said that. We follow their leadership. We follow what they tell us. We don't question them. I know reporters, and they're always like, but I need to check sources. That's not my job. My job is to ensure that detention center is shut down, and this is the strategy that we set. And you're welcome to work with us if you're willing to follow that leadership. At the end of the day, I really hope that most journalists agree with us that we don't want any detention centers open. Like Shannon on the story of the Sheridan prison, that's a story we work on with as well. We work here in CTAC. We did a whole West Coast actions against all these Bureau of Prisons contracts that ICE signed into, where thousands of people were sent to these 3 different prisons, Victorville, Sheridan, and CTAC, in 3 different states in the West Coast. So we can be a guide, but we also want to be collaborators. We want to ensure that both areas of work are working in tandem. So at the end of the day, we can accomplish what we're trying to do, which is really liberation of our people.
I think some of the tensions that arise as lawyers and journalists, we professional obligations, the questions that annoy organizers, the investigation. How do we remain accountable at the same time also within our own profession have a sense of objectivity or neutrality? And so I think we're going to come to those tensions a bit. But before we get to that, I want to encourage those who are listening to introduce yourselves, to ask questions in the chat box, chat with me on the side. We have some phenomenal guests, and so I want to make sure we maximize our time. Next, I want to invite David Brand and Christina Carrega from Queens Daily Eagle and Brooklyn Eagle, New York-based, who's been really, I have to say, from a personal standpoint, my paid gig is as a law professor at the City University of New York. And David and Queens Eagle has been from day one supportive of any initiative that has a grassroots community focus, which makes sense as a local media, has reprinted some of theMargins articles and has reprinted, as well as LA Progressive, some of the We the Immigrant series, which we hope we can continue to talk about collaboration. So I want to have them come in to talk about their work, but also just commenting on this sort of broader topic of how do we get to cultivating community media and grassroots voices. Michael talked about editors don't want these stories. The only way we were able to do this is through a small grant, and because of the generosity of our reporters who put in labor that definitely was not valued as much. So how do we sustain community media? How do we work together? So David and Christina, and then next, Albert, you can just bring on directly Dick, and I think I see Sharon there from LA Progressive to answer the same thing from LA. So thank you to our community media partners.
Hey.
Hi, thanks for having us. And so to answer that question, I think we are a local newspaper in a place that regards itself as the world's most diverse urban center, and always Queens calls itself the world's borough. But I don't think that's reflected necessarily in a lot of the local coverage. It tends to focus on specific neighborhoods and maybe more of a status quo perspective, which I think can be easier because the people who are sending press releases, who are doing outreach to media, are often the people with power, and yeah, kind of learn those skills and learn how to connect. And so for us, it's been really important to try to highlight that diversity of our borough and highlight the stories that aren't getting told in major New York papers and also our fellow local newspapers. And that's why I've been so happy to connect with Law at the Margins and with Chaumtoli in particular for trying to build some of those relationships and build that trust.
Okay. Yeah, and Queens Daily Eagle only started about 4 or 5 months ago, so we're new. The Brooklyn Eagle, our umbrella, has been around for many decades. So it was exciting for people in the courthouses and around Queens to learn that there's actually a newspaper that's dedicated to this borough. So when we started getting noticed by different organizations, whether it's lawyers or other types of people in the small business community, they were very anxious for us to tell their story. And the fact that we're the editors of the paper, we understand the need for Queens news to be told. It's exciting that we're able to put the voices to people who don't get their voices heard in the bigger papers as well as these smaller papers. And you'll see David and I in the courthouses, in the streets of New York, whether it's just Brooklyn or Queens or Manhattan, we're out there and they know who we are, and we're easy to get in contact with via social media and Facebook and through our website. You can always find us, you can send us a pitch and we're willing to listen. So that's how we're able to get those stories out there, just being present and people know who we are.
Thanks a lot, David. I also want to bring in our folks from the West Coast in terms of Dick and Shannon. You guys have been around for 10 years, a little longer than our friends here at the Queens, at the Queens Eagle. But how does this, as Chaumtoli mentioned, how does this work that folks are trying to do around solutions-based journalism? How does that fold into the mission you guys are striving to do, and also the challenges that there is in terms of trying to produce this kind of work in the modern landscape that we have today?
Yeah, hi. We're Dick Price and Sharon Kyle. We started the LA Progressive more than 10 years ago, really to work on some of the issues that you're talking about here. Citizen journalism, bringing in voices that are overlooked in the mainstream media, particularly on the progressive side of the ledger. We also wanted to bring the various disparate progressive voices together in one site.
So our focus really is collaborative journalism. Obviously, Dick and I rely on a host of writers who contribute their work, and they contribute it without any financial compensation. And what I think that we provide to them is a platform that allows them to reach more people. We have a somewhat of a significant social media footprint. And so we use our social media footprint, and we also use the LA Progressive website. And it's a daily publication. We publish between 3 and 5 articles a day. The biggest challenge for us is just staying alive. And so one of the ways that we do that is we do events. We do maybe 4 to 6 events a year, and that helps us to stay alive.
And let me say that we're really excited about this community-based network model. The whole thing about the GoFundMe campaign, so that you can pay journalists, because we're proud of the articles that we're able to present. But unlike some of the articles in these series, they typically don't represent on the ground actual reporting. And some of the ones in these series, or maybe all the ones in these series, are very welcome here, and it's also a model that we're going to try to replicate for ourselves. We were particularly impressed with, or it resonated most strongly, the article that Carla Pineda wrote, because in our work in activist groups here in LA, we are associated with people who know that the voice of Black migrants is oftentimes overlooked. We're pretty close with Zach Mohammed of Baji, the Black Alliance for Just Integration, and Pastor Q, who run with Black Lives Matter, but also with Row Church, and so we were particularly pleased to be able to present that point of view and actually want to follow up with it further.
We can't hear you.
One of the comments I want to make, just to kind of clarify, Michael was on the ground. Paul was also on the ground in Iowa. But when we say on the ground, I think for me it means actually the community organizers. And I think this is where the relationship building is really important. Well, definitely there's some challenges of not physically being close to those you are interviewing. But I think that the effectiveness, even in Carla's piece from LA and talking to people across the country, was because of building these sort of deep relationships with the community, as Maura was saying, is building these community media relationships. So I just want to now, so I just kind of want to stress that we can actually do this model. I think sustainability is a real issue. To Dick and Shan's point, we're struggling with that, which is why we're doing GoFundMe. But I think when we think about, Eric and I conceived sort of on the ground, we thought of it in a very decentralized, dispersed way. How can we build relationships with the community and making the community, as he said earlier, convert the community into its own newsroom? And so I just want to kind of lift that up a bit. But I want to just open it up, to a couple of themes that have come up and maybe hand it back to Eric or an Albert to lead us in a Q&A around a couple of themes. How do we get the trust of the community? The best reporting comes when we are connected to the community. And how do we sustain these? And then I guess the tension of we have to be objective. We do have to fact check. But at the same time, how do we do it in a way where there's some aligned goals? So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to one or piece of those questions, but in this remaining time period, we want to really get to that. And our overall goal is to build a ecosystem of community media folks, which is why we have all of us together today. And that's our longer term vision. So we hope this collaboration moves forward. So, but just on those kind of themes about accountability, balancing that with objectivity, how do we make this work financially? I'm a labor lawyer. I can't have journalists, they need to eat, they need to live. How do we sustain this? How do we actually make it viable for citizen journalists who are impacted to also support themselves? Chandra Delaney is a low-income mother and writer, someone whose son is incarcerated. How can we pay her so she can be a reporter for us? So these are some things that we're thinking about, and we love your comments, questions, also from those on the chat side.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in here and just talk about how do we reach out to our community. Before being publishers and editors of the LA Progressive, we're both activists. So we are highly engaged in the activist community. We are go to Black Lives Matter events and ACLU events, and we have tentacles in the activist community across the board, whether you're talking immigration or education reform or the host of other issues that are of concern to people who care about people.
And so what that allows us to do is many of our writers are recruited. They're not typically professional journalists, more they are as full-time activists, or they may work for these other organizations. So we spent 10 years pulling the community into what we do. And you're right, it's absolutely valuable. I mean, that's the thing that the citizen-based journalism offers the world. It gives a voice to people, as you said, voice to the voiceless, the people in the past when you know, you couldn't get an article in the LA Times if you tried, but now if you work at it, you can, and that gives a more diverse look at what's going on in our country.
Right. So by focusing on the activist community, diversity is something that we're able to get that other larger outlets aren't. For the most part, the people who are writing about the issues in the LA Progressive are living the issues. But the other thing is, we've been working for 10 years trying to find out a financial model. You know, how do we monetize this? How do we pay writers? And the only thing that we've come up with, and this is very recently, is by doing events and raising funds that way. I mean, we've been working for a long time looking for a financial model, and that's the only thing we've been able to come up with.
So the other thing that we came up with is you work for 40 years in some profession, and then you spend your retirement on your publication.
Yeah, so obviously we're older. Well. We're older, and so we have a little bit of savings. So we're really self-funded.
David, I'm curious to hear also about how you guys are a startup. You guys have to, I think one thing that you realize is that we live in a world now where every potential community organization also has a media platform, right? And so the idea also that people might be producing content, but newspapers just don't produce content, right? There's context, there's combination, there's a certain amount of combinations. So how do you guys create a community institution and at the same time support community media efforts, at the same time also establish yourselves at the same time?
Yeah, so we always open our paper and our website for people who want to write op-eds, and we always welcome those, like whether they're in the profession, that they have a voice for every type of topic that's happening. Lawyers, it doesn't matter what your profession is. We do consider different people's point of views, and we take those submissions very seriously. If we do get an op-ed from some person who has, a voice of some type of topic that they really, really want us to, print, it's up to us as the journalists in the situation to do the fact checking, to make sure that this isn't just a agenda-driven topic that they're trying to get printed in the paper. We have to be responsible and not just put anything out there, because we do understand that not everybody who writes is actually a journalist. So that's where our job comes into play. To go back to the point about how do we pay these people to write for us, that is something that we should really discuss more. We're funded, we have a corporation behind us, and we do have freelancers that we do pay, whether it's a student or not, we do pay our freelancers. So others who do want to write for us that aren't trained journalists, that is a topic that we will probably have to take up with our higher ups on how to get some type of budget going for that in particular.
And I think, so we mentioned lawyers because we focus on the legal community, and often, that gets told from one type of, one perspective and the narrative of people in power, who often tend to be the prosecutors. So we try to spend a lot of time sharing the perspective of the defendants, of the public defenders, of the people in communities who are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system, or are disproportionately affected by low-level offenses like marijuana possession, by turnstile jumping. And we like to get these perspectives into the courthouse, because I think it can be an effective way for people in power, for judges, for prosecutors, for community leaders to see these perspectives that maybe they can be too often insulated from.
Mm-hmm. Eric, I know that you've had some experience. What's your thoughts in terms of how we can kind of keep the lights on, right? How these folks can keep the lights on and pay the bills and generate the stories, and not just generate the stories, but also understanding that folks who are doing community-based work, at the end of the day, also, as Chaumtoli says, like, people need to pay their bills, right? Like a good story can have impact and change, but you can't do that if you don't have the resources to also keep yourself alive, right? So what's your thoughts on some of that?
Well, I mean, I think you definitely have to think about the financial model, for this. It can't just be producing journalism and that's it, because journalism alone isn't going to isn't sustainable. So you have to provide more value and figuring out, I think, a membership model, what Sharon was speaking about, events, bring something of value to people that they can be a part of, and building a community in the true sense of the word, the full sense of the word is what this newsroom is all about. It's producing the journalism, but also producing a community. And now with technology, we are all in different places, talking, communicating. You can have a virtual community, a digital community, and that is strong. And that's what we want to do is create a newsroom with people, all over the United States or even the world, who feel like their voice isn't being heard, and give them a platform where their voice can be heard. And we believe that people will support this. I think there's a hunger for this type of journalism. There's people who feel left out of the conversation, left out of the narrative, whose story is not being told or is being misrepresented. And people, if you give them the opportunity to tell their story and help guide them, because maybe they don't know how to tell their story in the most effective way. And as a journalist, with a lot of experience, you can help people who aren't trained professional journalists tell those stories. And that's really what we are doing here. And it takes time, to do that, and it takes a lot of patience. Sometimes you're working with people and you have to get on the phone, talk to them, you have to have email conversations and help guide that story to get it to a place where, it's maintaining the highest level and standards of journalism. So there are challenges with this model, definitely. And people, citizen journalism and working with the community, it's not a new concept. It's been done for many years, and people got away from it because it wasn't successful. But I think times have changed. There's a lot of new technology now that makes it easier to collaborate. And I think that's what we're doing. And really, we believe, it's gotten to a point where if we don't help, underrepresented communities and marginalized communities tell those stories, and they're not going to be told, and they will remain invisible, and those communities will remain invisible, and that we don't want that to happen, because these are human beings, these that are getting demonized, that are getting dehumanized. Their stories are not true, and they're a lot of times, and so the current media landscape is, we believe we can make it better, and we believe that we can bring to light, stories that are in the shadows right now, and do that, and it just requires time, and will, and dedication and discipline, but it's doing the same journalism that you did in the traditional newsroom, but now it's just really at the grassroots level, and earning trust, building trust, going into communities, that maybe the only time you would go into them as a journalist was to tell a story. And a lot of times it would be a negative story about something that happened, but we want to spotlight also the positive stories, what's happening in a community. There's so many great stories, and you can't tell them all, but I think if we can create a model that empowers the community to be able to tell their own story, that's what we want to do. Is, if you give hungry people a fish, they will eat for a day, but if you teach them how to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. And the same idea is what we want to do with journalism, is show people, and kind of demystify journalism. Sometimes people can be intimidated by journalism and think that they don't have the skills to tell a story, but everyone is born with stories, your birth story and your family history. That's the first story. Everyone has one. And it's just a matter of coaxing it out of people and really encouraging people to tell their stories. And then once they become more confident storytellers, and once they become more confident in expressing themselves, then that is where you can really do some important work and impactful work. And because they are the closest to, a lot of times, the underrepresented community, marginalized communities are the closest to, they're living the injustice, and they are the best reporters to speak on it. And that's what we want to do, is bring that out of people, and it's a matter of going to the source of the injustice and building relationships with those people who are suffering indignities and injustices, and helping them raise awareness of the injustice so that we can change it and make it create justice. So
I know we're wrapping up here. I know we're closing in on this count, but we want to bring back on Michael. I know you had a couple of thoughts on this, especially from the perspective of, you know, kind of a writer and reporter, you know, on the ground.
Yeah. Can you hear me all right? There we go.
Yep.
So I'll make it real brief. I just I don't have the answer as to like how to make citizen journalism you know, utterly viable, but I do feel that there's been this change, this shift in communities that I go into, in that the fringe is kind of the majority now. And when I work for larger organizations, I get this feeling where a lot of reporters are just they're repeating the news rather than reporting the news. And what people are craving is like real stories, these voices, the voices that aren't being heard. And I think when you put something together like the community-based newsroom, and you come out of the gates with really strong stories, these stories are really good. You have to use that as the momentum that this is what we did. These are the stories that we have created, and no one else is reporting on that. And then hopefully, I think my story got picked up, you know, by a number of different outlets, and other stories got picked up by a number of different outlets. That's the momentum that people need to see, and then that's the momentum that if you use a GoFundMe, that you create an environment where people are looking at you, looking at the community-based newsroom, looking at the work that we all do to provide more. And so it's this kind of a slow burn that hopefully it becomes this, you know, you start small and you get conical and you get bigger and bigger. So, and it happens. And I think people are really craving that rather than looking at these stories that, oh, I just saw the same story here, same story here, same story here. I haven't seen any of these stories prior to what Chaumtoli and Eric and the rest of the writers have created. So I think this is a great start, and it's a great way to continue to try to do some fundraising. And I'd be interested to hear more from, is it David, I think, or Paul, about the organizations that they do fundraisers for, or they have these events for. Are they having readings? Are they having bands? What are they doing in terms of that? But those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see that. I think that model that you know that Dick, you know, talked about in terms of newspapers really who are part of the community, really being a part of also the events of that community. I think we see a little bit of that here. For example, in Miami with the Miami New Times, which is, you know, used to be an offshoot of the Village Voice. I think the other thing to remember too is that, you know, a lot of us are talking about ideas and communities, and that for the most part are coming either with a progressive bent, or at least are traditional kind of are been in the kind of the traditional progressive kind of media landscape. And if you want to talk at least a little bit about politics, the truth is that the right has been building their media platforms for a while. So that's all to say is that there is a hunger, right, to build stories and to go back into what Michael was saying about authenticity. People do want to read about these things. And so the real question, I think, for a lot of us who are in whether you're talking about, you know, politically progressive or just trying to like lift up the voices of communities, regardless of what point on the political spectrum you fall on, the truth is that there are people who are interested in doing that. And I'm amazed to, you know, when you see about how, especially during the 2016 election, how a whole bunch of folks, you know, made money off of these fake news sites. And I knew so many progressive sites who were just struggling to fund it. And again, I think it's a question of folks who I think traditionally have been so used to working on a model of giving forth to others, trying to figure out how do we better organize not just our political power, but in many ways, you know, organize our money, right, to support you know, some of the things that we want to see, and support the kind of journalism that allows for people to grow. I think one of the things that was very interesting in this conversation here today, that we heard it from Carla, from Michael, from Shannon, from all these folks here, is the idea that that especially as journalists, as reporters, people are learning new things, right? They're learning about these communities, and sometimes they're hesitant about going into communities because they know that they are not the key stakeholders or perhaps the gatekeepers there. And so, you know, journalism also has to create a space for its reporters to grow with a sense of context, right, with a sense of also knowledge, so that reporting can also get better, right? That stories can get better, and that we can kind of create new things. So I think this is one of those ideas that I mean, it's a conversation that we need to continue to have, and I think we all agree that this, we want the CBNR to this is just kind of the bottom floor of a of a journey that we hope will expand and grow. Eric, Chaumtoli, I know we are getting close to kind of the end of time, so I want to make sure that that everyone's got a chance to kind of speak.
Sorry. If it's okay, could we bring on Dick or Carla and Maura for last words? I think it'll be okay if we extend a few more minutes, just because I know we're ambitious. Eric and I, we think big and bold, and Albert as well. The joke of this newsroom is started with, what do you get when you get a lawyer, a journalist, and sort of a technologist, communication and media technologist? You get the community-based newsroom. It's not so funny, but that's how we began. But so I do want to get others to maybe last words, and then Eric and I will just wrap up and share what are our next thoughts. One of which is a collaborative fundraising, and I see Carla on the screen about going to grants and foundations. We're stronger together than as an individual, smaller platforms.
Yes, working at KCET, we were previously independent. Link TV, it's a national channel that we have under a satellite network, or on the satellite network. And it's a very, scrappy, independent channel that we don't have public funding as PBS, the PBS side of our company does. And it's been, working here 4 years, I've seen how important it is to go out to the community and kind of learn about what people want to learn about, the stories that they want to hear, the stories that, to reflect what the community needs, And in doing that, I know a lot of our fundraising team, a lot of our foundations team, they go out and they speak to the big foundations that are, like I mentioned in the chat, they're ready, they have funds to really go out. And sometimes it's just 5-10 grand, but 5-10 grand for a project like ours can go a really long way, So I've seen how that works out here from a TV station, an independent TV station point of view. And the idea of collaborating with different media outlets and kind of coming together to really create, dream up a project that reflects what the community needs. I think that could that could garner a lot of support, a lot of funding from different, not only community organizations, but across the board, national organizations that, just want these stories to be told well, that quality journalism, there's a hunger for it out there, so. And I just last thoughts, I'm very extremely grateful that I was allowed to participate in this webinar and this project. This has been amazing, and I'm very grateful to be able to share the stories that I was able to tell. So.
Great. Do we have? I guess we'll wait for Dick and Sharon, but just some last. So next steps, and then I'll also invite Eric. First of all, I want to thank everyone who participated today. Albert, starting off. Oh, okay. Dick and Sharon before. Why don't you go ahead, because I'm going to be doing closing, Eric and I. So just your thoughts on events.
Okay, so we found that if you collaborate with events, it can be beneficial.
No.
Oh, did we lose? Yeah, I think we
lost them.
Yeah, we might have lost them. So let me just go through just some next steps. So first of all, just thanks to everyone who participated today. Albert Garcia for moderating us, who's been with me since actually day one of Law at the Margins. Eric Ortiz, is always really an honor to learn so much about journalism. What makes me want to go to journalism school? Not, no. Eric Ortiz, who really with his passion is really driver of the community-based newsroom. Our writers, Carla, Shannon, Michael, but not on the screen, Paul Street and Irvis Orozco, and Solution Journalism Network, that really a $2,500 grant is what would produce this. So, someone, I think Carla had said, 5,000, 10,000, we know how to work it. We do want to pay a living wage to journalists and our writers, but we can do a lot with that. Maura for really giving us some things to think about of how do we remain accountable to communities that we report on, how our work also impacts them. And then also locally here in New York, David and Christina for their participation today and collaboration, and Dick and Shannon at LA Progressive. So just thanks for everyone else who participated. So just next step, some thoughts, and we can continue this offline, is the idea of sort of maybe a collaborative funds, continue to build our sort of relationships with each other. If there are folks that you know of that we should be in contact with, let us know. We want to build really a community of folks who share our vision and our mission and support each other. Sharing our reporting, one of course, in terms of cultivating journalists who are also like-minded, like Shannon and Michael and Carla, but also potential new writers, Dick and Shannon. As you're seeing activists who you think could be potential journalists and writers, can we reach out to them? Joint events. Let's do something 2019 in New York and LA. We're ready here, maybe in Miami. Events as a way to really get this model out there. So these are just some ideas of next steps. Eric and I will continue to really collaborate. We're doing a big push for this GoFundMe to raise some funds so that we can do some of the ideas that we have. I'll just end there. I'm gonna let Eric and Albert, who are really the journalists of this trio, to maybe close us out. And thank you everyone so much.
Yeah, I'll just, thank you everyone for participating in this. I think the more we can raise awareness, the better. I think, and show that this is possible. Producing good journalism, great journalism, takes time and effort, but it can be done. Where there's a will, there's a way, and we really believe this model can be successful, and the more that we prove that it can be, it will allow others to see the possibilities, and so that's really just everyone is doing great work, and I think there's strength in numbers if we can collectively figure out ways that we can work together and continue to keep this conversation going. This is just the beginning of creating a great big newsroom. You can have different outlets, but if you can all come together, there's many ways that we can collaborate, not just in the production of journalism, but in events, in fundraising, all these different ways. And so it's just a matter of being open to this idea of collaboration to do journalism, and really having an inclusive newsroom and an inclusive open mind about journalism. Sometimes journalism can kind of, or a problem in journalism, and really why we started this is because it can be exclusive at times, and kind of keep people out of the editorial discussion who have a right to be there, and it really makes the stories better and stronger. And we're really open to telling new stories, telling stories that aren't being told, and giving people the tools so that they can then tell their own stories whenever they want. So
many times I think we think about journalism, and and we think about stories in a very two-dimensional way. I think today we've learned that storytelling, especially when it comes to our community, is a three-dimensional, maybe even four-dimensional kind of model there. And I think it's important that we remember that behind the words that gets produced, there are real human stories, and there are people that are there. And so we've seen that all today through, talking to both reporters and writers, the folks who have to sign the checks and pay the bills in terms of, publishers, in terms of newspapers who want to do good but are facing challenges. And I think that's part of what we try to do with these webinars, and what Law at the Margins have tried to do from the very beginning, is put a face on the stories and let us know. So much of today's world is impacted because people hear news from a certain perspective or a certain angle or a certain look. And I think the truth is it's a lot to be able to say that diversity is a strength, but it's not a strength unless we put it into action. And so I think with today's, our thoughts about models, it really is about trying to find solutions and trying to archive and use our storytelling abilities to push communities forward and to make sure that we're all growing in the right way. So I'm happy to be part of this project. Happy to be working in collaboration with folks that I see, and also folks who are behind the scenes. And so, it's another great Law at the Margins webinar, and hopefully, we'll continue to do these things, bigger and better things, into the new year. Don't forget the GoFundMe. The GoFundMe campaign. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Support Our Community-Based Newsroom link that has a link to the GoFundMe. Share this video. Pretty soon after we stop, it'll be shareable here on this site as well as on Facebook and the other places there. Make sure folks know. And if there are any questions, Chaumtoli and Eric, I know, are always up at all hours of the night answering questions. So I think that's all we have for today. From all these different types of places around the country, New York, I think on the West Coast, and here in Miami, we bid you good afternoon, and always keep growing, always keep surviving.
Thank you all.
Thank you.